And welcome back to the show. Open New York is an all-volunteer group advocating for the abundant homes and lower rent. Now, the group believes in housing for all and housing of all types, and it supports more social housing, as well as government-subsidized housing and then market-rate housing. Now, their vision is if anyone wants to, they should be able to afford housing in New York City, and to achieve that, the city needs to build more housing in all neighborhoods at all income levels, especially in wealthier neighborhoods, which historically haven't done their fair share. Joining us to discuss more is the board member for Open New York and district manager for Community Board 6 in the Bronx, John Sanchez. And John, good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
You know, the thing that really sticks out for me is that part of this vision is that everybody should be able to afford housing and to have a home in New York if you want to. But we know that isn't the reality, as home prices are just ridiculous. So how do we get to the place of having more affordable housing, more homeowners for more city residents?
Well, the first challenge is that we're just not building enough housing, as ironic as that may seem to people that see construction in their neighborhoods. The census numbers just came out, and New York City gained about 600,000 people, but only 270,000 new housing units were built. And it's inequitable as well. There's 59 community boards that represent neighborhoods throughout the city. Of the new units of housing that were built, only half of them were built in only 10 community boards. So 49 other community boards aren't doing their fair share. If we had every community board do its fair share of building housing, we'd have more availability, rents would be lower, and it'd be a more fair city.
Yeah, but when we look at it, we see development is going up, but it's not affordable housing. When we look at the rent prices, we have astronomical rent prices. We've got people being priced out and moving out. You've got gentrification happening in other places. How do we tackle this, and how do we make this better?
Well, it's a two-pronged approach. One, we need to build much more housing. I was actually looking at apartments on Zillow this week, and I looked for any two-bedroom in the whole city that's less than $1,500. And I found less than a dozen results, which shows you that there's an issue citywide. The second approach is that we know that for some people, even $1,500 a month is too much for them. Even $1,000 a month is too much for them. So in that case, that's where we need the state, federal, and city government to step in to provide vouchers to help with that extra rental assistance. So we need to build more housing, but also provide vouchers for people that need that extra assistance to cover the rent.
And so a little bit about your organization, because it's a volunteer organization, but definitely boots on the ground when it comes to making an impact.
For sure, we're an all-volunteer group, and we're passionate that every neighborhood in this city needs to do its fair share of providing affordable housing, including the wealthy neighborhoods, such as Soho. I used to live in Soho. I went to NYU. And as a Black and Latino man from the Bronx, my chances of getting into NYU were greater than my chances of living in Soho right now. And too often, rich neighborhoods say that affordable housing threatens the neighborhood of the neighborhood character. It brings elements that they don't want. What they're really saying is they don't want to live near people that don't make millions of dollars.
Right. And when we look at that, of course, they feel as though that's not how they want to live. And I want to talk about high-income housing,
Yes.
Because there is such a thing as high-income housing,
Yes.
And it increases affordability from your perspective. So share with me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the idea behind the Soho Rezoning is that the city has something called MIH, which means if you're going to rezone a neighborhood, a certain amount of the units need to be affordable. Now, as many of your homeowner listeners may know, $1,000 rent doesn't cover a lot of housing expenses. So the way the Soho Rezoning would work is that the high income rents, the rents that are $5,000, $6,000 a month, those would help cover the cost of the lower rents, the $1,000, $1,500 a month rents. Because it's important for people to know that we all want $1,000 rents across the city, but there's a cost to providing housing. You have to fix the boilers, the kitchens, the bathrooms, and there's a cost incurred with that. So we need to make sure that we're covering those housing costs as well as providing affordable rents.
Yeah. And so as you guys are working right now, what do you have currently in the pipeline?
Well, the big one is the Soho Rezoning. We're anticipating that the city council will vote on this before the end of the year. And I think it's important that this one goes through because the Democratic nominee for mayor, Eric Adams, has voiced support for this. other mayoral candidates voiced their support for it. And this can show the city that there are no gated communities in our city. Every neighborhood, whether it's rich or poor, has to do its fair share of providing affordable housing for our city.
Yeah. Well, you get some people who say the city is building affordable housing. How do you counter that argument when they say the city is building enough affordable housing?
Well, the fact that we have 75,000 people in the shelter system, the fact that we have 1.5 million people that live in overcrowded conditions show that the city is not building enough. The city has built some units that are affordable. And when I say affordable, I'm talking about $1,000 rents. But there's not enough. As we showed, the pandemic, people have lost income. Even when it comes to rental assistance, the state has done a poor job of providing relief to renters and small homeowners. So we're not building enough, and it's not even close.
Yeah.
In fact, cities such as Austin, Texas, Houston, even Jersey City are building more housing units than New York City.
Yeah, but I mean, I've got family in Austin, but they'll tell you in a minute that if you go down to downtown Austin, it's the same thing. The rents are ridiculous. I mean, you have to be able to afford a certain income in order to be able to really substantively live in there. How do we get around this? Because, you talk about affordable housing, and, all housing is not always affordable housing. And when you talk to lawmakers, they'll tell you, listen, we're building a fair share of affordable housing, but my question always is where, and my question always ends up being how much?
Well, it's important, especially in New York City. We were building twice the amount of housing that we were building in the 60s than we are right now. So one, we're just not building enough. But I think to your bigger point, the rent just isn't affordable for folks. That's where we need rental vouchers, where the federal government provides vouchers for people where they can go anywhere they want in their city to cover the rent. Because the voucher amounts that the federal government sets, they're significantly higher. A federal voucher can cover $1,900 for a studio, $2,500 for a two-bedroom. The rents that we see when we walk through our neighborhoods, we need to expand the amount of those vouchers. But then if we have all these voucher holders, we need to make sure that there's enough housing so they can use that voucher somewhere.
Yeah. I want you to tackle for a few moments the topic of exclusionary zoning and how that pertains to the work that you do. But first, can we do me a favor? I want you to give our viewers a little bit more of an education as to what exactly is exclusionary zoning.
Zoning is a word that describes the rules of what can and can't be built anywhere in the city. There's some zoning that only allows commercial development. There's some zoning that only allows residential, etc. Right now, we have exclusionary zoning where we have wealthier neighborhoods in the city that only allow single-family homes to be built. This is really prevalent in areas such as Westchester and Long Island that are near the LIRR stop, but they don't allow six-story buildings to be built. And there's a pattern of neighborhoods like Soho, Riverdale, Throgs Neck, where they don't want six-story apartment buildings to be built because they say it threatens their neighborhood character. I just think they're trying to exclude people from living in those neighborhoods. And that exclusionary zoning needs to be lifted, and we need to have zoning that allows people from throughout the city to live anywhere they want to.
Yeah. You talked about Democratic mayoral candidate Eric Adams and him weighing in on the housing matter. What kind of expectations do you have from him, if elected, getting into office when it comes to the issue of housing?
I think it's important for our elected leadership to not talk in general terms. If you want to build more housing, it's important that we have a number behind that. New York State lost a congressional seat because we didn't grow our population enough. I'd love to see the next mayor have a bold vision and say he wants to build 1 million more units of housing in the next 10 years so we can gain a congressional seat, and specify neighborhoods that need to share the responsibility of providing this housing. A goal without specifics is just a dream.
Yeah. Well, we talked about losing that congressional seat, and I've heard arguments that have been made, and there's some people who made the argument that say, listen, you got New York flight. A lot of people are leaving New York, and they're leaving New York because they can't afford New York. And so when we talk about losing the congressional seat, that possibly because New York has become overpriced, the price we paid was the loss of a seat. Would you buy into that argument at all?
No, because most of the growth that New York did see was from the 5 boroughs. We gained 600,000 people in the boroughs. most of the population loss came from outside of New York City, areas that may not be as opportune for job opportunities. So I dismiss that. But I think to your point, long term, we need to address the affordability crisis in the city and the state, so we don't go to a situation where we start to lose population in the boroughs. But we're in New York City, the best city in the world, and people will always want to come here, whether they're coming from across the country or whether they're coming from around the world. This is the best city to be.
Yeah, and I'll go back to what I just said in the last segment, because I mean the last question I talked to you about, because you, as you disagreed, obviously we know that more people did not leave New York City, and then there are critics who also say this. You know what? The reason why people don't leave the city is because that's where the wealthier people are, and they have more, so they're able to sustain themselves more. How do you argue against that?
Well, I think it's important for people to realize, there are certain states that, people mention. They mention Florida, they mention Georgia, but those cities don't have the strong social safety net that New York has. I mean, if you need to get benefits in New York City, it's readily available, whether the mental health services, whether it's food stamps, whether it's rental assistance. New York City is very generous with that. And also we have a large amount of jobs in this city. We have a good public transit system where, unlike those southern cities, you don't need to have a car. You can take public transit. New York City has a bunch of benefits and assets, and I don't foresee us losing any population anytime soon. We're still the biggest city in the country.
We are the biggest city in the country, absolutely. Also, you represent Community Board 6, and let me to get some insight into what's going on over there.
Yeah, Community Board 6, we're in the Central Bronx. We have Fordham, East Tremont. Board has always approved new housing, whether it's affordable, whether it's supportive housing, or even if it's market rate housing, because we realize that you can't solve a housing crisis by not building housing. So I'm proud that my board has been supportive of more housing. We have a hotel coming up on Arthur Avenue, addition with a 7-story residential building. So we're building a lot here, but we just wish every other community board in the city did the same thing that we did.
Yeah. What was the key in turning the corner there? Because obviously, as you've been able to see some success in some areas, what do you fashion that around?
I think as a district manager, my job is to inform my board and educate them. And I just tell my board, here are the stats. Here's how much housing we have. Here's how much housing we would need to cover everyone. Here's how many shelters we have. And the board realizes the more housing we get, it eases the burden for people to live here. And most people want to have a neighborhood where housing is abundant, where their family members can move into the neighborhood, where people can move within the neighborhood. And our board member gets it.
Yeah. Public involvement. That's, we talked about part of our show is dealing with civic engagement and really getting the public more and more involved. But in the height of COVID and just coming out of COVID, dealing with the Delta variant, a lot of us are asking the question about how involved are people in their community, given the fact that, a lot of people living in survival mode. How do you find community involvement and engagement in the work that you got going on?
Well, I see that the remote meetings that we've been having during the pandemic have actually helped increase involvement and participation at our community board meetings, because people don't have to stay late night in a venue and go home late. They can be on their phone, they can be in their computer, they can participate and learn what's going on in their neighborhood. And I hope that that continues, because we need to get to the 21st century. We shouldn't have to meet in the evening after work to talk about housing in our neighborhoods. And it will always be a challenge. We have a digital divide, but I'm hoping that more virtual meetings take place, especially when it comes to local government.
Yeah. Before we go, talk to me about how people can get in touch with you and stay connected to the work that you're doing.
Well, first and foremost, if you're interested in having more housing across the city, go to opennewyork.city. We're looking for more volunteers throughout the city, especially in the Bronx. And that's the best way to get involved. Open New York. We have meetings in person, we have meetings remotely. And we want to turn the paradigm in this city to show that New York City can be a city that's open to all newcomers and existing residents, where they can find an affordable place to live.
John, I want to thank you so much for being with us here on the Social Justice Forums. Appreciate hearing you and hearing your perspective when it comes to this whole issue of housing. Thanks much.
Thank you, Daren.